Austin started down the hall with his suitcase when he saw Dr. Paulo heading his way. The doctor smiled and nodded his head at Austin and walked straight into him. Austin stopped and looked at Dr. Paulo and was about to say something when the doctor spoke first. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Lieutenant. How clumsy of me." The doctor took Austin's free hand, pretended to shake his hand, and slipped a small glass vial into Austin's hand. "2 drops in Earl's coffee, 1 time, and within 2 hours our problems will be solved," he whispered. Austin slipped the vial in his right pant pocket and smiled at Dr. Paulo. "No worries, Doctor." Dr. Paulo nodded and continued down the hall. The 3 men sat down at the briefing table in President Paulson's office. The president sat at the head of the table nearest the door to his office, and Austin sat to his left. Philip sat down to the president's right. Both Philip and Austin remained quiet and professional during the briefing. President Paulson's aide, Mr. King, was indisposed, and the president was quite annoyed with this. He looked straight at Austin. "Give me a cup of coffee, will you?" Austin's stomach turned into nerves. This was too good to be true. Austin hid his nervousness and got up and went over to the coffee carafe that was on a cart directly behind the president and right next to the door to his office. He glanced over his shoulder. President Paulson's back was to him, and Philip was not paying any attention to what he was doing. There were not any cameras or recording devices in the president's office, so Austin could add the drops without being seen or recorded. Austin quietly poured coffee into the president's cup. He took the vial out of his pocket and carefully opened the vial. He had to hurry before the president got suspicious over taking so long to pour a cup of coffee. Austin glanced over his shoulder one more time. The president was still facing the other way. Austin quickly put the first drop into President Paulson's coffee, but just as he was putting the second drop from the vial into the president's coffee cup, Mr. King barged into the office unannounced. Mr. King looked directly at Austin and the vial in his hand, and then over at the president. Mr. King hurriedly walked over to President Paulson. Austin quickly put the lid back on and slipped the vial back into his pocket. He had nerves of steel, but could feel his heart race. Mr. King walked up to President Paulson and stood between him and Sergeant Adams. "Don't you use the intercom to come in here anymore, Mr. King?" the president said in an annoyed manner. President Paulson looked over his shoulder towards Austin. "How long does it take you to pour a cup of coffee, Lieutenant Miller?" Mr. King looked over at Austin. "I will fix the president's coffee. I know how he likes it. Just leave the cup there, Lieutenant." Austin nodded and left the cup next to the coffee carafe and sat down next to Philip. Austin remained calm and unaffected on the outside. He took several slow, deep breaths through his nose. That always helped to calm himself down. "Are you going to tell me what you burst into my office for, Mr. King, or are you just going to stand here all day?" "Mr. President, I have urgent news," Mr. King stuttered and pushed his glasses back up to the bridge of his nose. "Spit it out, Mr. King," the president snarled. "Yes, sir. Let me get you some coffee first. You are going to need it." Despite the president's impatience, Mr. King took the time to go over to the coffee cart. Austin watched Mr. King like a hawk. He wondered if Mr. King was going to get another cup and pour a fresh cup. Mr. King looked at the coffee cup and then at Austin. Mr. King smiled at Austin and brought the cup over to President Paulson. "Drink this, sir. It will help you to take this news." He held the cup out to the president. President Paulson grumbled but took the cup and drank the entire cup of coffee, and then slammed the cup down on the table. He leaned forward and became so angry at Mr. King that his eyes became almost red. "Tell me now," he yelled. "Yes, sir. The governor of New York is dead." Austin and Philip's mouths dropped open. "What?" President Paulson screamed loudly and stood up. "He can't be dead. That's impossible." President Paulson looked at Mr. King and took a few steps away from the briefing table. He turned and looked at Mr. King. "What happened? How did he die?" President Paulson's body jerked twice. Mr. King was shaking. "They think it was the flu, Mr. President." Mr. King looked at Austin and Philip and then back at President Paulson. Austin and Philip stood up and moved away from the table a few feet and to their left. President Paulson turned in a circle and looked up at the ceiling and flung his arms around. "It's a lie!" He turned and looked at Mr. King, who was visibly shaken. President Paulson laughed. "Ha, ha, ha! His voice was deep and evil. "Androids don't die, Mr. King." A look of shock swept over everyone's faces. No one dared to say a word. President Paulson was about to say something when he suddenly cried out in pain, "Ah!" and put his hand to his stomach. He managed to move closer to the table and grab onto the back of one of the chairs. He looked at Mr. King. "What did you put in my coffee?" President Paulson groaned grotesquely. "Ugh." Then he fell to the floor. He writhed in pain and held onto his stomach. He looked up at Mr. King. "How is it that I am feeling pain?" His eyes were full of fear. Dr. Palo was one that went to bed early. He was sound asleep when there was a loud knock on his door. He got out of bed as quickly as he could, grabbed his robe to put over his pajamas, and answered the door. He opened the door after taking a breath and letting it out slowly. Had Lieutenant Austin Miller turned him in? He sighed in relief as he saw Sergeant Cooper. "What is going on, Sergeant Cooper? Come in, please." Sergeant Cooper entered Dr. Palo's quarters and closed the door behind him. He looked around and spoke in a hushed voice. "President Paulson has taken ill, and we need you to fly out to Washington, D.C. Stat. Austin requested you. I have a private plane ready for takeoff. I will be flying out with you and another agent." Dr. Palo was nervous and words escaped him, so he simply nodded and rushed to get dressed. A few minutes later, he came back from the bathroom, picked up his black doctor's bag, and followed Sergeant Cooper. A GUV, also known as a government utility vehicle, was waiting on the main level parking lot for them. The driver drove them outside into the back of the facility, where an old but well-maintained road was used for the presidential plane and the other 3 planes that were housed at the facility that were used by the SMU agents. Sergeant Cooper escorted Dr. Palo onto the SMU plane and helped him to get situated in his seat, and then sat down next to him and buckled his own seatbelt. There was an agent that was sitting in the row behind them and looking down at a map. Once the door was closed and the plane started down the runway, the agent looked up. Dr. Palo glanced over at him. "Special Agent Fisher, how nice to see that you will be joining us on our little trip." Dr. Palo felt relieved and smiled at Frank. Frank grinned at Dr. Palo and Sergeant Cooper. "Thank you. I am happy to be on board. No pun intended." Frank was grateful that Sergeant Cooper called him and asked him to come in for a special and very important mission. Dr. Palo looked at Sergeant Cooper. "Who is our pilot and co-pilot?" Sergeant Cooper smiled. He knew that Dr. Palo was making sure that everyone on the plane could be trusted. "Agent Jerome Santos." Dr. Palo absent-mindedly nodded and did a quick double look at Sergeant Cooper. "He knows how to fly a plane?" Sergeant Cooper laughed. He patted Dr. Palo's shoulder. "Relax, you're in good hands. Jerome has been flying small planes for 20 years. He used to help his family on their farm in Puerto Rico by dusting crops when he was 17. Dr. Palo nodded and closed his eyes and held on tightly to his small black bag that was on his lap. Frank looked at Sergeant Cooper and whispered, "Should we tell him that there's no co-pilot?" Dr. Palo's eyes opened quickly. Sergeant Cooper looked at Frank, stifled a laugh, shook his head, and then turned back around. He spoke without looking at the doctor. "Don't worry, Dr. Palo. I know how to fly a plane." Dr. Palo barely turned his head towards Sergeant Cooper, nodded, and then closed his eyes again. Frank and Austin stepped forward after Dr. Clark left. Frank looked at the instrument that Dr. Palo was holding. Dr. Palo changed a few settings and held the instrument up to President Paulson's head. Austin stepped forward. "Dr. Palo, what is Paulson's prognosis?" Dr. Palo looked at Austin and said quietly, "He is gone." Austin and the others remained silent for a few minutes while Dr. Palo reached behind President Paulson's left ear, parted his hair, and pressed on the skin covering the mastoid section of the skull. The skin, which was not real skin at all, parted and a microchip came out of a built-in slot. Dr. Palo held up the small microchip. "This gentleman is President Paulson." Dr. Palo handed the microchip to Austin, who inadvertently made a face and wished that he had been wearing gloves, while Dr. Palo took a small microchip holder out of his bag. He turned to Austin and took the microchip from him and placed it in the holder. He looked at the men in the room. "Who wants to be the holder of President Paulson?" All of the men made faces, and none of the men volunteered. Dr. Palo shrugged his shoulders and said, "I guess I will be the holder of President Paulson." Austin spoke up. Shouldn't we destroy that, Doctor? Dr. Paolo shook his head. There's a lot of valuable information on this microchip. It contains the fingerprint of the person or persons who made Paulson and perhaps had him put in office. The men looked at each other. It was more serious than they had thought. Philip wanted to hear confirmation. So what are you saying, Doctor? Is that someone made Paulson and programmed him to be an evil president? Austin winced. Philip made it sound that they were all in some bad horror movie. Dr. Paolo looked at Philip. If you can bring me to a safe computer, then I can show you and explain it much better. Sergeant Cooper spoke up. Will a laptop work? I have mine with me. He held up the case as if to show everybody. Dr. Paolo answered, Sure, this is the 4th millennium after all. Everyone followed Sergeant Cooper and Dr. Paolo over to the small table that was in the infirmary, and Sergeant Cooper set his laptop down on the table, remained standing, leaned over, and booted it up. Dr. Paolo sat down in the chair in front of the laptop and looked at Sergeant Cooper. Do you have a scrambling program on here? Sergeant Cooper nodded. He leaned over Dr. Paolo's shoulder and brought up the scrambling program and activated it. Dr. Paolo nodded and inserted the microchip into the docking slot that was located on the right side of the computer. In less than a minute, a program popped up. Sergeant Cooper looked at Dr. Paolo. I didn't know that my computer could do that. Dr. Paolo smiled at Sergeant Cooper. It's in the software on the microchip. Philip looked at Dr. Paolo. Will whomever it was that created the beast be able to tell that we are accessing the microchip? Dr. Paolo answered, They would if we did not have a scrambling program. Philip nodded. A very complex chart appeared on the computer. In vertical waves, it showed the outline of President Paulson's form. Dr. Paolo clicked on the brain center part of the graph. Several pages loaded. Dr. Paolo scrolled through the pages. This gentleman is President Paulson's programming. Frank leaned forward. All I see are numbers. Correct, Dr. Paolo stated. This information is coded. It would take maybe months or even years for us to decipher it all, unless we had a mainframe computer. Sergeant Cooper looked at Dr. Paolo. What can you tell us now? Dr. Paolo went back to the previous screen and clicked on the skull and used the control key to change the image to a side view of Paulson's skull. He then clicked on the lower back portion of the skull, on the occipital bone. As the computer visual passed through the skull and went deeper into the left hemisphere of President Paulson's brain, a mathematical sequence appeared. Dr. Paolo looked at the men, leaned back in his chair and smiled and crossed his arms. Watch. He turned his attention back to the computer. Layer after layer of mathematical sequences appeared. Once they reached the 21st sequence, the computer started to slow down. Symbols appeared on the screen that only Dr. Paolo recognized. He took a breath and let it out slowly as he said, look at that, gentlemen. That is what is known as the 5th dimension of the android brain. All the men leaned forward and furrowed their brows, trying to understand what they were seeing. Dr. Paolo watched the screen until it stopped loading. He took his finger and pointed it at the lower right portion of the screen. And this, gentlemen, is the fingerprint of President Paulson's creator. Frank looked over at the body of President Paulson and held his breath. He looked at Dr. Paolo. I don't mean to interrupt, but there's a beeping sound coming from Paulson's body. Dr. Paolo looked at Paulson and listened. Everybody quick, drop down to the floor and take cover. He's going to... Before Dr. Paolo could finish his sentence, they heard 3 fast clicks, and then there was a sudden explosion. Philip shrugged his shoulders and looked at Austin. I don't know, but what if I am a hybrid, and I just don't know? Look at Corporal Faith. He didn't know. Austin smiled at Philip. Frank stepped closer to Austin and looked at him. Austin held up the scrambler. Well, there's a simple way that we can find out, my friend. Philip looked at Austin and then at the scrambler. He nodded his head. Austin smiled and said, Okay, I am going to turn on the scrambler and then I am going to say something. If you can hear me, you are fully human. Do you understand? Philip nodded. If you can't, then you are either a hybrid or a full android, Austin explained. Philip said, Okay. Austin grinned and turned the scrambler on while Philip and Frank watched. Austin moved his lips as though he were speaking. Frank looked at Austin's mouth. Philip looked at Austin in horror. Oh my God, I can't hear what you are saying. Philip screamed and turned away from the men and put his hands to his head. Frank looked at Austin blankly. I didn't hear anything either. Austin burst out laughing and Philip quickly swung around and stared at him. I just found out that I am not human and you are laughing? Philip yelled. Man, you are so gullible. You can hear me talking now, right? Yeah, Philip nodded. Austin pointed to the scrambler. It's still on. Frank caught on to Austin's joke and hit Austin in the ribs with his elbow. That was mean, Austin. Frank turned around and covered his mouth to stifle a laugh. Austin looked at Philip. I was joking with you, Philip. Philip looked at Austin and then at the scrambler and then at Frank, who was not hiding very well that he was laughing. Philip looked at Austin again and burst out laughing. Frank turned around and let his laughter out, and he and Austin and Philip had a good laugh for a while. Philip walked over to the end of the bed and sat down. Man, that was mean, Austin. Hey, you pinched me in Paulson's office to see if I had human skin. You had that coming. Frank looked at Austin. He pinched you? Austin nodded. Frank looked at Philip and pointed to Austin. You really pinched him? Yeah, I wanted to see if he had human skin. It's a long story. Philip leaned back on the bed and laughed and then sat up again. I can't believe I fell for your joke. He looked at Austin. But you have to admit that it was funny, Austin said with a smile. Philip nodded. Yeah, it was pretty funny. Milt and Austin hung out a few more hours, and then Austin went back to his quarters. He took out his private phone, sat on his bed, and looked through his photo gallery. He still had all of the pictures of him and Sasha. Austin laid back on his bed and looked up Sasha in his phone contacts. He paused a moment and then called her. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up. Hello? Sasha. Austin, why are you calling me? Austin smiled. It was good to hear her voice again. He thought of her big, beautiful brown eyes and her beautiful, soft, dark skin. I wanted to talk to you and see how you are doing. Sasha was silent for a moment. I'm doing okay, considering. But South City was not hit, so things are somewhat normal around here. Are you dating anyone, or did you get married? No. Austin sighed silently in relief. I never stopped loving you, Sasha. Austin, we haven't talked in 2 years. That was not my choice. You could have called or sent me a text once in a while, Sasha said quietly. I didn't want to hurt you, and it was too hard. Sasha remained silent. How do you like where you are living? Austin asked. I don't know, it's the same old apartment that it was 2 years ago. Maybe you should think about moving. Where would I move to, Austin? How about Washington, D.C.? Austin, I don't know anyone in Washington, D.C. Austin smiled. Have you heard the news about President Paulson? I did. That was wild. He looked healthy to me. I think he was murdered. Austin laughed through his nose. Austin, what's so funny about that? Austin looked at the ceiling. It's a long story. I will tell you another time. Sasha, President Sayers asked me to be on his security team and on a special task force. Austin, that's great. I am happy for you. Congratulations. I'm thinking of getting married. What? I am thinking of getting married and bringing her with me to D.C. There was dead silence for almost a minute on the phone. Sasha? Is that why you really called me for, Austin, to tell me that you are getting married? Oh, I wasn't good enough for you, but you can go and find some hoe and marry her and bring her with you? Austin laughed. I don't think that's very funny, Austin. I don't hear from you in 2 years, and you have to call me and throw it in my face that you are going to marry some hoe. Sasha. Sasha kept going on and did not hear Austin say her name. Sasha. What? Sasha said loudly. You're still in love with me, aren't you? What do you care? You are going to go and marry some hoe, and you call me up and have the nerve to tell me about it, and then to add insult to injury, you ask me, tell me that I am still in love with you? Well, Austin asked. Well, what? Sasha asked, annoyed. Are you still in love with me? Austin, you know I never got over you. That's why I haven't dated or looked at anyone since I told you to leave. And why did you tell me to leave? You know why. You just wanted to shack up and treat me like I do not matter. Like I wasn't good enough to marry. Sasha, you were good enough to marry. I just wasn't ready for it. So, I am now. What? Sasha, I want to marry you. I want you to come to DC with me. You're gonna dump that hoe and marry me and bring me to DC? Austin laughed. Sasha, there is no one else. I have not dated anyone since we broke up, not even one date. What? Then why did you let me go on believing that you were dating and going to marry some hoe? Austin smiled. Sasha, I am asking you to take me back, marry me, and move to DC with me. Well, alright. I'm in Nevada right now. How soon can you be ready? Frank got out of the car and walked into the terminal and towards the checkout counter. He was so busy looking at the e-ticket on his phone that he did not see that the blonde-haired woman in line in front of him had suddenly stopped, and he ran right into her. Oh, excuse me, Frank said. The woman did not look at Frank but said, no worries. She checked in and left in a hurry without even looking at Frank. Frank watched her walk off, and then he checked in and found out that they were already boarding passengers on the plane. He made it to the gate just in time. Frank got on the plane and found his window seat. He loved the layout of the new 2-seat per side planes. He had never been on one before, but he had heard about them on the news. There was a woman already sitting down in the aisle seat. It was the blonde woman that he had run into at the checkout counter. Frank did not want to be rude and climb over her, so he looked at her and asked, would you mind terribly letting me through? Frank asked politely. Frank noticed that the woman had earbuds in and probably did not hear him. He was about to ask her again when the stewardess tapped him on the shoulder and said, would you mind taking your seat, sir? We are about to take off. Frank nodded and looked at the blonde-haired woman that was seated. Now she had her head in a book in addition to the earbuds. Okay, lady, which do you want, my backside or my front side in your face? The woman looked up at him shocked. I beg your pardon? Frank's mouth dropped open. He pointed to earbud.